And then let me ask you, did you, on November 13th, 2022, enter the residence at 1122 King Road in Moscow, Idaho, with the intent to commit the felony crime of murder?
Yes.
Did you, on November 13th, 2022, in Latah County, state of Idaho, kill and murder Madison Mogan, a human being?
Yes.
And did you do that willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation and malice of forethought?
Yes.
Did you, on or about that same date in Moscow, Idaho, kill and murder Kaylee Gonzalez, a human being?
Yes.
And did you do that willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, and with premeditation and malice of forethought?
Yes.
And did you, on that same date in Moscow, Idaho, kill and murder Xana Kernodle, a human being?
Yes.
And did you do that willfully, unlawfully, deliberately, with premeditation and malice of forethought?
Yes.
Incredible, but true. This is Bryan Kohberger, 28 years old, a criminology graduate student. A young man who studied the minds of killers, yet he became one himself. On the night of November 12, 2022, 4 students, Kaylee Gonzalez, 21, Madison Mogan, 21, Xana Kernodle, 20, and Ethan Chapin, 20, were found brutally murdered in a quiet college town in Idaho. The irony of fate is chilling. When police finally arrested him, he claimed he was tormented by other prisoners, that his life was in danger, as if that could undo what he had done.
Sentenced to life without parole for the brutal murder of 4 Idaho college students, says he's being tormented by other prisoners. Bryan Kohberger says he's being kept awake behind bars by non-stop taunts from the other inmates.
Yet, for years, he moved freely, blending into society, until that one fateful night changed everything. Welcome to your channel. Welcome to Caseborne. It was a quiet November night in Moscow, Idaho, the kind of night where streets are empty and the town seems to hold its breath. The house, located just off the University of Idaho campus, appeared ordinary from the outside. Its modest porch light flickered faintly, the lawn trimmed, the windows dark. Nothing hinted at the horror concealed within. Inside, the ordinary veneer shattered in an instant. The first to encounter it were the surviving roommates, returning from what had been an evening of ordinary routines. Their footsteps, hesitant at first, turned frantic as they entered. Panic clutched at their throats, and their hands trembled as they pulled out phones and dialed 911. The words stumbled from their lips, fragments of horror strung together, desperate attempts to explain the unexplainable. 4 of their friends, Kaylee Gonzalez, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, had been brutally murdered. The dispatcher's voice was calm, methodical, a stark contrast to the terror on the other end. The roommates struggled to convey the chaos, their sentences breaking under the weight of disbelief. They're not moving. There's, oh my God. Every word carried the shock, the incomprehension of witnessing death in a place that had always felt safe. Minutes later, emergency responders arrived. The street was illuminated with the red and blue of police cars and ambulances, their sirens slicing through the night. Officers moved quickly, carefully, into the house. They stepped through rooms that had once held the comfort of daily life posters on the walls, backpacks tossed in corners, laptops left open, and now were transformed into scenes of violence. Furniture was overturned, objects scattered as if a storm had passed through, and in the midst of it all, the undeniable evidence of a struggle that had ended in the loss of 4 young lives. The first responders worked methodically, their radios crackling with updates. Every room revealed more of the tragedy. In the living room, remnants of normal college life lay alongside stark signs of brutality. Bedrooms that had once been personal havens were now silent chambers of death. The smell of blood mingled with the faint scent of candles and air fresheners, a grotesque collision of the familiar and the horrifying. Outside, neighbors began to gather, drawn by the lights and the sound of sirens. Whispers spread quickly. Who could do this? Was anyone here safe? The news moved through the town like wildfire. Fear seeped into every corner of Moscow, a place that prided itself on safety, community, and the rhythm of small-town life. The idea that such violence had penetrated this quiet enclave was almost impossible to comprehend. Inside the house, the surviving roommates oscillated between terror and attempts at clarity. They recounted fragments of their evening, footsteps they thought were the wind, shadows passing behind blinds, noises that had seemed innocuous until confronted with the aftermath. Each recollection was a thread, tenuous and disjointed, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. They clung to memory fragments, desperately attempting to trace the moments leading to discovery, each detail sharp with the sting of disbelief. Meanwhile, law enforcement moved with precision, documenting the scene, collecting evidence, taking photographs of every detail. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing marks on floors, broken furniture, and objects out of place. Each step was measured, careful, because in chaos, a single detail could make the difference between clarity and confusion. Every corner of the house was examined, each room catalogued, each surface analyzed. The house that had been a home was now a focal point for methodical investigation. Time stretched unnaturally as night bled into early morning. Emergency lights flashed against the walls, shadows moving across the floor in rhythm with police movements. The house seemed to breathe with the tension of what had occurred, every room a silent witness to events no one wanted to understand. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the fear and disbelief of a community forced to confront the unimaginable. For the neighbors and the broader town, the event shattered the ordinary. Moscow had been a place of quiet routines, of coffee shops and campus walks, of evenings that ended with the soft glow of street lamps. Now it was a town suspended in a tense, fragile awareness. Conversations turned to speculation. Every passerby, every familiar face, was momentarily viewed through a lens of suspicion and anxiety. The ordinary streets felt alien, the familiar houses now silent observers of the night's horror. Now, let's step into the first days of the investigation, a period when the town of Moscow, Idaho, was gripped by fear and confusion. The night of November 12th had already left the community shaken, but the following hours and days brought a new kind of tension, a slow, creeping dread, layered with uncertainty and questions that seemed to have no answers. Police and investigators faced a scene that was as perplexing as it was tragic. Inside the house off campus, the rooms had been meticulously examined, but the chaos was undeniable. Furniture was overturned, objects scattered, evidence of struggle all around. The walls seemed to echo the violence that had occurred, each detail demanding attention. Officers moved cautiously, aware that a single misstep could compromise crucial evidence. Every inch of the house was photographed, measured, and documented. They noted everything: the position of each victim, the placement of personal belongings, the traces of blood and fingerprints. Each tiny detail could be a key, a thread that, when followed carefully, might lead to the person responsible. At the same time, rumors began circulating throughout the town almost immediately. Students whispered in dormitories, neighbors speculated over fences, and social media amplified every fragment of information. Eyewitness accounts, often conflicting, muddled the narrative further. Some reported seeing strangers near the house the night before. Others insisted they had noticed nothing unusual. Each rumor demanded investigation. Each tip had to be assessed, verified, or discarded. Investigators faced a delicate balance. They had to follow every lead while separating credible information from hysteria. The pressure was immense, and every decision was scrutinized not only by colleagues, but by the anxious eyes of a town desperate for answers. The media descended quickly, turning the case into a story of national attention. Cameras and reporters were stationed near the campus and around the neighborhood, capturing every moment, every press release, and every update from law enforcement. Local residents found themselves thrust into a spotlight they had not sought. Every movement was documented, every reaction amplified. Headlines appeared online within minutes, each one more sensational than the last, heightening the town's anxiety. Students walked more cautiously, doors were locked earlier, and the familiar rhythm of the town was replaced with vigilance and unease. Meanwhile, families of students far from campus began calling in worried questions, their voices trembling with fear for their children. Parents of roommates or classmates sought reassurance that their loved ones were safe, while campus authorities struggled to provide guidance amidst the unfolding chaos. Some students left town temporarily, returning home or staying with family, unwilling to remain in an environment that now felt unsafe. The ripple effect of the crime spread far beyond the house itself, touching every corner of the community and altering daily life in ways that would last for months. Inside the investigation teams, the work was relentless. Detectives and forensic specialists moved through the house repeatedly, re-examining rooms, comparing notes, and testing every piece of evidence. They traced the movement of the victims that night, reconstructed the timeline, and questioned anyone who might provide insight. Each interview added fragments to the puzzle, some fitting perfectly, others raising more questions than answers. The pressure to solve the case quickly was immense, not only for the sake of justice, but to restore a sense of security to a community paralyzed by fear. During this period, even the smallest clues became vital. Officers examined surveillance footage from nearby homes and businesses, looking for vehicles, people, anything unusual. Each ping from a cell phone, each digital footprint, was analyzed to trace the movements of potential suspects. Every object at the crime scene, every fork, every piece of fabric, every shoe print was cataloged, tested, and preserved. The attention to detail was exhaustive, because investigators knew that one overlooked piece of evidence could be the difference between justice and continued terror. At the same time, the human element of the investigation was a delicate balance. Officers had to manage traumatized witnesses, the surviving roommates who relived their horror each time they recounted what they had seen. Their statements, while crucial, were difficult to navigate. Grief, shock, and fear often interfered with clarity. Detectives had to maintain compassion, patience, and precision, ensuring that the victims' friends and families were supported while still gathering the facts necessary to build a case. Throughout the town, the atmosphere was tense and unsettled. Students walked in pairs, glancing nervously at dark streets and quiet corners. Residents double-checked locks, reinforced security systems, and looked at neighbors with new suspicion. Cafes, libraries, and common gathering places felt quieter, as though the community itself were absorbing the weight of the tragedy. Conversations were tentative. Every mention of the crime brought hushed tones and wary glances. The collective anxiety was palpable, a shared tension that seemed to settle over every street, every classroom, every home. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement also contended with the complexity of coordinating multiple agencies. The local police worked alongside state and federal authorities, sharing evidence, coordinating interviews, and pooling resources. Meetings stretched long into the night, strategies were debated, and decisions weighed carefully. Every officer understood that the eyes of a town and now a nation were watching, and the stakes could not have been higher. Even as they worked tirelessly, the detectives were aware of the psychological toll on the community. Schools offered counseling for students, dormitories held meetings to discuss safety measures, and public statements reassured families that every effort was being made to capture the person responsible. But reassurance did not erase fear. Parents worried for siblings, roommates feared for each other, and friends replayed the events of that night over and over in their minds, searching for signs they might have missed. Despite all this chaos and tension, investigators remained methodical. They reconstructed the events leading up to the crime, examined possible motives, and tested alibis. Rumors and wild theories were carefully weighed against facts. Each step was deliberate, each decision considered. Yet for the town, the slow pace of justice felt agonizing. Weeks could not pass quickly enough. Answers could not arrive fast enough. The uncertainty gnawed at Moscow, leaving the community trapped in a liminal space between shock and the faint hope that clarity would eventually emerge. Even in the early days, it was clear that the crime had altered the town irrevocably. Students who had once walked freely across campus now hesitated. Neighbors who had chatted over fences now spoke cautiously. The rhythm of everyday life had fractured. Every routine, from morning coffee to evening study sessions, carried a subtle weight of anxiety. The ordinary had become a lens through which fear and suspicion were filtered. The investigation, in its earliest days, was as much about managing the town's fear as it was about analyzing evidence. Detectives knew that public trust was fragile and that any misstep could erode confidence. Statements were measured, information released with care, and the narrative controlled as much as possible. Social media, with its relentless circulation of rumors, had to be monitored. Every post, every shared story, could influence witnesses, add pressure, and shape public perception. Through it all, the memory of the victims, their names, their faces, their laughter, remained central. Kaylee, Madison, Shauna, and Ethan were not just statistics. Their presence was felt in every interview, in every news story, in the cautious footsteps of students across campus. Each investigator carried with them the responsibility to ensure that the work they did honored the lives lost, while bringing the person responsible to justice. The early days of the investigation set the stage for everything that would follow. They were a mix of meticulous evidence gathering, tireless interviews, and a community grappling with the unfathomable. The fear, the rumors, the media frenzy, and the uncertainty created a pressure cooker environment where every detail mattered, every step counted, and every decision could shift the course of the case. One of the first significant breakthroughs came from surveillance footage. Cameras surrounding the neighborhood captured a dark-colored Hyundai Elantra near the crime scene on the night of the murders. At first, it seemed almost incidental, one car among many passing through quiet streets. But detectives recognized its potential significance. They examined the footage frame by frame, enhancing images, noting the car's movements, and comparing it with other nearby camera angles. Each time the Elantra appeared, it narrowed the timeline, slowly revealing patterns that had initially gone unnoticed. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued their meticulous work inside the house. Every object, every surface was carefully examined for traces of DNA, fingerprints, and other evidence. One critical discovery was DNA, the sheath of the knife used in the attacks. Forensic analysts ran multiple tests, verifying the profile and ensuring there were no errors. This DNA did not match any of the victims, instantly creating a crucial link to a potential suspect. Each confirmation strengthened the investigation, offering detectives a concrete thread to follow amid the chaos. The digital footprint of the suspect soon became another key element. Cell phone pings placed an individual near the crime scene at critical times. Investigators cross-referenced these signals with timestamps from surveillance footage and witness accounts. Slowly, a timeline began to emerge, showing movements that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Every ping, every location update added a piece to the puzzle, transforming a chaotic scene into a structured narrative of the night. Detectives then began reconstructing the suspect's presence, step by step. They traced routes, examined points of entry and exit, and mapped the locations of each victim in relation to the evidence. Each clue camera footage, DNA phone data was plotted together to create a coherent picture. The process was painstaking, requiring hours of analysis, consultation with forensic experts, and repeated verification. But it was this very attention to detail that allowed the investigation to move from uncertainty toward clarity. Witnesses were re-interviewed to confirm small but critical details. Residents who had noticed unusual activity around the house were asked to recount their observations. Even seemingly minor memories, a car idling too long, a shadow passing a window, a door opening at an odd hour, were compared against the timeline established by evidence. Step by step, the investigators reassembled a chain of events that brought the suspect into focus. Simultaneously, forensic teams focused on reconstructing the crime scene itself. Blood spatter, the positions of the victims, and other minute details were analyzed repeatedly. Forensic experts examined angles, force, and placement, creating simulations that helped investigators understand the sequence of events. These reconstructions, technical and methodical, gradually provided clarity. They showed the calculated nature of the attack and allowed detectives to identify behaviors consistent with a single, determined perpetrator. As these investigations unfolded, the pieces began to connect. Surveillance footage confirmed a vehicle's presence. DNI placed an unknown individual at the scene. Phone records tracked movements in and around Moscow. Investigators could now draw a timeline linking all the evidence, step by step, to a person who had until then remained almost invisible. Each clue reinforced the others, creating a web that left little room for doubt. Even with these breakthroughs, the work remained exacting. Each connection had to be verified, cross-checked, and documented. Investigators consulted forensic specialists, digital analysts, and behavioral experts to ensure that every interpretation of evidence was accurate. No assumption was left untested. The scrutiny was intense because in a case of this magnitude, any oversight could compromise the ability to bring the perpetrator to justice. The culmination of this meticulous work was a picture that investigators could trust. The suspect was no longer an abstract figure. He was defined by his actions, his movements, and the evidence he left behind. Step by step, the net tightened around him. Where once there had been uncertainty, now there was clarity. A person of interest who matched the data from cameras, DNA, and digital tracking, someone whose presence could be placed at the scene, and who could not easily account for the events of that night. By the end of this phase, the investigation had transformed. What began as a chaotic and terrifying crime scene had evolved into a precise reconstruction of events. Detectives had mapped every relevant detail, connected each piece of evidence, and traced the suspect's presence with a degree of accuracy that made arrest inevitable. The town of Moscow remained tense, aware that the investigation was closing in. But for investigators, there was no room for celebration, only methodical, relentless focus. The next step would be to move from evidence to action, to translate the painstaking reconstruction into a decisive intervention. Every camera frame, every DNA match, every phone ping, and every witness account had brought the team closer to the moment when the suspect's freedom would finally end. And as detectives pieced the timeline together, step by step, the contours of the suspect's night became clear. The evidence spoke not only of opportunity, but of movement, timing, and presence. Forensic science, technology, and methodical investigation converged, creating a narrative that left no room for doubt. Every lead confirmed another, every detail reinforced the others, and the investigation had advanced from a blur of tragedy into a precise, actionable understanding of what had occurred. Now we arrive at a critical turning point in the investigation. It was December 30th, 2022. Weeks of tireless work surveillance, forensic analysis, digital tracking, Witness interviews had converged on a single location, the Kohberger family home in a quiet Pennsylvania suburb. What had been a series of scattered clues was now about to culminate in decisive action. In the early hours of the morning, law enforcement assembled outside the house. The street was still, the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off the frosted pavement. Officers moved with measured precision. Each step was deliberate, every position carefully coordinated. Tactical teams prepared for resistance, while negotiators readied themselves for any unexpected scenario. The entire operation had been planned down to the smallest detail. Months of investigation would be tested in these tense moments. Inside, the house was quiet, ordinary, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos that would soon unfold. Families slept, unaware that outside, a team of officers was about to execute a highly choreographed intervention. The stillness heightened the suspense. Every knock, every announcement, was met with anticipation. Officers knew that even a single misstep could jeopardize months of painstaking work. At the first official announcement, police called out that they were entering on a warrant. The sound echoed through the hallways of the house. Inside, movements were made cautiously. The team ensured that the environment remained secure and that no harm came to anyone present. As officers entered, the suspect Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody. The arrest was swift, methodical, and executed without incident. In mere minutes, a long and complex investigation had moved from theory to action. Meanwhile, across the country, news of the arrest began to travel. Authorities confirmed that a suspect had been detained, and the announcement sent shockwaves through the community of Moscow, Idaho, and beyond. Families of the victims were notified immediately. Relief, sorrow, and disbelief mingled in their responses. For some, the arrest brought a fragile sense of closure. For others, it reopened wounds, making the tragedy feel even more immediate. Statements issued by relatives reflected the complex blend of grief and hope. Grief for lives lost, hope that justice would now be pursued. The media descended on the story almost instantly. News outlets broadcast the arrest, capturing images of the suburban street, the house, and the law enforcement vehicles stationed outside. Viewers across the country saw the tangible moment when months of uncertainty were finally confronted. Reporters described the operation with careful attention to facts, emphasizing that the suspect had been detained peacefully, highlighting the precision and professionalism of the police teams involved. As word of the arrest spread, friends and classmates reacted with stunned silence. The person responsible, previously an abstract figure in headlines and discussions, now had a tangible presence. Conversations shifted from speculation to reality. The suspect had a location, a custody status, and a direct connection to the case. Social media buzzed with reactions, messages of relief, grief, and solidarity pouring in from all corners of the campus and town. Local authorities worked to manage both the physical and emotional aftermath of the arrest. Officers remained on site for hours, ensuring the safety of neighbors and maintaining order. Families and community members gathered, some waiting for updates, others simply trying to process what had just occurred. Counseling resources were made available, recognizing that the arrest, while necessary, could trigger renewed trauma for those directly affected by the tragedy. The arrest itself became a carefully choreographed narrative of tension and resolution. Law enforcement had anticipated every possible scenario, the suspect's movements, potential resistance, and even the psychological impact of being confronted with authorities. Every officer involved understood the importance of discipline, restraint, and precision. Their actions reflected months of preparation, from analyzing evidence to planning entry strategies, ensuring that the culmination of the investigation would result in custody rather than chaos. Throughout the day, authorities released measured statements, confirming the arrest without divulging sensitive investigative details. This careful balance maintained the integrity of the ongoing investigation while providing reassurance to the public. Families of the victims were encouraged to stay informed through official channels, minimizing the risk of misinformation spreading during this highly charged moment. Even as the suspect was transported to a secure facility, the community felt the weight of the arrest. Relief mixed with apprehension. While one chapter had concluded the capture, the legal and emotional journey was only beginning. Families prepared for the next steps: arraignment, charges, and ultimately, the trial. The arrest marked the end of one phase, but signaled the start of another, where facts and evidence would move from investigation to the courtroom. For investigators, the arrest was both a milestone and a moment of reflection. The months of methodical work surveillance footage analysis, DNA testing, tracking phone pings, and interviewing witnesses had culminated in this decisive action. Every detail, every careful observation had contributed to a successful operation. But there was no celebration, only the recognition that justice had taken a concrete step forward. In the quiet aftermath, the town of Moscow began to process the arrest. Streets were cautiously reanimated, dormitories resumed their routines, and conversations shifted from fear to cautious optimism. The arrest did not erase the tragedy, nor did it eliminate grief, but it marked a tangible moment when the person responsible was no longer at large. It was a turning point that allowed the investigation to transition from reconstruction to accountability. Now we arrive at the courtroom, where months of investigation, analysis, and preparation would be tested under the scrutiny of the law. Bryan Kohberger, now in custody, faced the formal process that would determine his fate. The small Idaho courtroom, packed with family members, media, and legal professionals, became the stage for a drama months in the making. From the very first day, the atmosphere was tense. Families of the victims sat together, their grief mingling with a fragile hope that justice would finally be served. Friends and classmates filled the gallery, some with tear-streaked faces, others sitting in stunned silence. The legal teams, prosecution, and defense prepared meticulously, ready to present, contest, and analyze every piece of evidence with precision. The prosecution began by laying out the case with clarity and focus. Surveillance footage, phone records, and forensic evidence were presented step by step. Each piece told a story, weaving a timeline that placed Kohberger at the center of the night of November 12th. DNA evidence on the knife sheath was highlighted, and phone pings confirmed his presence near the crime scene at crucial times. Witness testimonies corroborated the sequence of events, painting a cohesive narrative of the crimes. Defense attorneys scrutinized each claim, challenging interpretations, cross-examining witnesses, and questioning the reliability of certain pieces of evidence. Their aim was to test the prosecution's case, to find inconsistencies, or to create reasonable doubt. The courtroom became a place of tension. Every word, every gesture weighed carefully. Observers could feel the intensity of the legal chess match unfolding, the stakes impossibly high for all involved. Among the moments that stood out were the statements from the families. With composed yet emotional voices, they recounted the impact of the loss, the irreplaceable presence of Kaylee, Madison, Shauna, and Ethan. Their words, delivered with courage and heartbreak, reminded everyone in the room of the human cost behind every fact and figure presented. Each testimony deepened the emotional gravity of the proceedings, grounding the legal arguments in the reality of lives cut tragically short. Throughout the trial, the jury was presented with detailed evidence, including the sequence of investigative steps that had led to the arrest. Surveillance footage was analyzed, cell phone data explained, and forensic methods described. Each presentation reinforced the narrative, the suspect's movements, the sequence of attacks, and the evidence that tied him conclusively to the crimes. Every piece was methodically examined, leaving little ambiguity. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and deliberation, the case moved to its final stage, the verdict. The courtroom was silent as the jury delivered its decision. Bryan Kohberger was found guilty on all counts. The sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words hung in the air, a tangible conclusion to a long, painstaking journey of investigation and justice. Reactions were immediate and profound. Families expressed a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been formally recognized, yet the void left by the loss of 4 young lives remained as sharp and painful as ever. Friends, classmates, and the community experienced a similar blend of closure and grief, knowing the person responsible was held accountable, but also facing the permanence of the tragedy that had reshaped their town. Outside the courthouse, media coverage captured the moment with care, emphasizing the gravity of the conviction while respecting the privacy and dignity of the victims' families. The legal system had spoken, but the human story, the grief, the loss, the memory of the 4 students continued to resonate deeply in the hearts of all who knew them. For the town of Moscow and the University of Idaho, the verdict brought a definitive, if somber, sense of resolution. Investigators and law enforcement teams, whose months of meticulous work had culminated in this moment, felt the quiet satisfaction of justice achieved. Yet the sorrow remained. The courtroom had delivered a sentence, but it could never restore the lives lost or fully ease the pain endured by families and friends. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of the events settled over everyone present. The story, meticulously reconstructed from fragments of evidence, testimony, and relentless investigation, had reached its conclusion in the form of a verdict. The sentence, life imprisonment without parole, was not only a legal outcome, but a societal acknowledgement of the severity of the crimes, the meticulous work of law enforcement, and the enduring impact on the community. In this moment, the trial was over, but the memory of the victims remained vivid. Kaylee, Madison, Shauna, and Ethan were honored in statements, in reflection, and in the collective consciousness of those who followed the case. Justice had been served, yet the silence they left behind, the emptiness in the lives of those who loved them, would persist far beyond the courtroom walls. Now, we turn to the man at the center of the investigation. Bryan Kohberger, a graduate student in criminology, appeared to many as an ordinary young man, yet the layers beneath the surface revealed a complex and unsettling portrait. Understanding him was not about justification. Nothing could excuse what had happened, but about revealing the profile of someone whose fascination with crime would ultimately intersect with tragedy. Born and raised in a quiet community in Pennsylvania, Kohberger was known for his academic focus and intellectual curiosity. He pursued higher education with dedication, eventually enrolling in a criminology doctoral program. On paper, he was a diligent student, respectful of routines and protocols, someone who appeared committed to understanding the intricacies of criminal behavior. Yet those who knew him personally described a more nuanced character. Former classmates recalled a man often socially withdrawn, someone who seemed to prefer observation over participation. Conversations painted a picture of an individual intensely focused on the study of crime, sometimes to the exclusion of everyday social interactions. He asked probing questions, engaged in debates on criminal psychology, and displayed a curiosity that some considered unusually intense, even obsessive. Friends and colleagues noted contradictions in his demeanor. In some contexts, he was articulate, analytical, and composed. In others, he appeared distant, introspective, and removed from the social circles around him. This duality contributed to a sense of unpredictability, a perception that while he navigated academic life competently, there was a part of him that remained enigmatic, difficult to read, and profoundly private. In discussions about criminal behavior, Kohberger demonstrated a meticulous understanding of motives, methods, and psychological patterns. He could describe, in clinical detail, the behaviors of offenders, the intricacies of investigative techniques, and the nuances of profiling. For professors and peers, his insights were impressive, sometimes unsettling in their depth and precision. Yet this same fascination would later cast a shadow, as the line between studying criminals and committing criminal acts became tragically blurred. Testimonies from former classmates emphasized the isolation that marked much of his academic journey. He often worked alone, conducted research in solitude, and maintained few close personal relationships. While not overtly threatening or aggressive, his behavior sometimes unsettled those around him. Observers described an intensity in his focus, a drive that seemed to operate independently of social norms or peer expectations. Despite this, Kohberger was capable of normal interactions, attending seminars, engaging in discussions, and presenting research with clarity and confidence. It was a paradox, socially withdrawn yet intellectually visible, curious yet secretive. Those who knew him well sensed a duality, a student passionate about understanding crime, yet someone whose personal boundaries and inner world were largely inaccessible to others. His obsession with criminal psychology was not merely academic. He consumed literature, case studies, and discussions about offenders in exhaustive detail. Former classmates recalled late-night debates, theoretical exercises, and discussions about forensic analysis that went beyond what was typical for his peers. It was a dedication that, in hindsight, foreshadowed the chilling intersection of knowledge and action that would later define his place in history. Colleagues described moments of unease, instances when his questions, comments, or behaviors suggested a mind preoccupied with darker themes. They noted an analytical detachment, a focus on patterns and hypotheticals, and a curiosity about human behavior that sometimes crossed into uncomfortable territory. Yet at the time, these traits were seen as eccentricities rather than warning signs, just another facet of an intense and introverted academic persona. Outside the classroom, Kohberger maintained a quiet lifestyle. Neighbors and acquaintances reported minimal social engagement. He appeared polite and unobtrusive, living largely under the radar. Even in these ordinary interactions, however, there was a subtle sense of distance, a careful curation of his presence, as though he existed both within and apart from the world around him. The portrait that emerges from these observations is complex, a student deeply immersed in the study of crime, socially isolated, intellectually precise, and intensely private. It is a profile that underscores the paradox of someone seeking to understand criminality academically while remaining a profoundly inscrutable figure in everyday life. Friends and peers would later reflect on this duality with a mix of disbelief and unease, recognizing traits that, at the time, seemed merely unusual, but in retrospect formed part of a troubling pattern. In summary, Bryan Kohberger was a man defined by contrasts: curiosity and secrecy, intellect and detachment, knowledge and isolation. His profile does not explain the crimes he committed, nor does it mitigate the pain caused, but it offers a window into the individual behind the tragedy, providing context for the investigation, the trial, and the profound impact on the families and communities affected. Now we turn to the aftermath, the long shadows that linger when a community faces tragedy. The arrest and conviction of Bryan Kohberger closed a chapter of legal accountability, but the impact of the events in Moscow, Idaho, extends far beyond the courtroom. The University of Idaho and the surrounding town continue to grapple with what happened. Safety, trust, and the sense of normalcy were shaken in ways that no policy could immediately restore. Counseling resources were expanded, community vigils held, and support networks strengthened, not just for those directly affected, but for anyone who felt the ripple effects of such a profound loss. The story reminds us that crime leaves more than physical scars. It leaves psychological and emotional ones, often unseen but deeply felt. This case also serves an important educational purpose. Following the investigation, we see how crucial it is to remain vigilant in everyday life. Simple precautions like securely locking your doors, being aware of who enters your living space, and carefully considering the people you allow close can make a real difference. The investigation shows how seemingly small details, like access to a home or proximity to individuals with questionable behavior, can have serious consequences. By understanding the investigative process, viewers can also gain insight into how law enforcement connects evidence and follows patterns, reinforcing the importance of awareness, caution, and personal responsibility. Above all, this story honors the 4 victims: Kaylee, Madison, Shauna, and Ethan. They were students, friends, siblings, and members of their communities. While their lives were tragically cut short, remembering who they were beyond the headlines is crucial. Their personalities, their passions, their presence in the lives of those who love them. These are the memories that endure, reminding us of the human reality behind every case. For viewers, there's also a broader lesson about empathy and resilience. Communities, when confronted with tragedy, often respond with acts of solidarity, remembrance, and care. Moscow, Idaho, is no exception. The response to these events reflects the strength and compassion that can emerge even in the darkest circumstances. This story is a reminder that awareness, support, and understanding are essential in the face of loss. Justice was served, but the silence left behind will never fade. If you found this video meaningful, we invite you to subscribe to Caseborne for more in-depth true crime stories presented with respect and care. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Each story we tell is not just about crime, it's about understanding, awareness, and honoring the lives affected.